Is trusting doctors for some things but not others hypocrisy? Should pro-life advocates compromise? And would defunding the Department of Education destroy America? We'll discuss these questions and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is a podcast where we gather takes that we see in our social media feeds every week, and we break them down, give our opinions on whether we think they are good or bad. My name's Britt. I'm here with my co-host Donnie, and before we get started, make sure to like, share, comment, subscribe. All of that stuff helps us out. You can find us on Instagram at Good Take, Bad Take Pod and Twitter and YouTube at Good Bad Take Pod. And without further ado, let's get into some of these takes. So the first one is, it's a quote retweet by David Hogg, and he's quote retweeting a CNN Politics tweet that reads, New Mexico's governor orders suspension of open and concealed carry of guns in Albuquerque, declaring gun violence and drug abuse a public health emergency after a string of recent deadly shootings. And David Hogg retweets this saying, I support gun safety, but there is no such thing as a state public health emergency exception in the U.S. Constitution. What do you think about David Hogg's take here?
I'm shocked. And I know we're a little late on this. I was out all of last week, and so we didn't get to jump into this right as it was hot off the presses. But in the meantime, since, I saw David Hogg's was the first that I saw on this, it's been crazy how many other lefty anti-gun Democrats have had this same sentiment. To the point where I'm almost wondering, what's the game here?
Yeah.
What's the ulterior motive? Because this seems too good of a take, which maybe that's my own bias getting in the way of my and sort of my own disposition to distrust getting in the way. But it is a correct take. And the funny thing is, if the term, I support gun safety didn't have such political connotations, I would say that this is pretty much every Second Amendment enthusiast's perspective, right? No one out here is saying, I'm pro Second Amendment, but I don't support gun safety. Like, we all want gun safety. What you mean by gun safety clearly is the kicker or whatever. But yeah, this is a good take. These the New Mexico governor clearly is stepping out of bounds in a way that the written law would not have it apply. And of course the law is only as real as people who enforce it. And so that's maybe why I'm so surprised to see people like David Hogg and others jump to this. I don't know if they're worried about fear of retaliation from Republican sides on some things. I don't know what the equivalent would be. But frankly, ahead of coming for like another COVID emergency or ahead of coming from another like climate emergency or something, I'm very shocked to see Democrats vocally oppose these kinds of disruptions to the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, it's very surprising. And like you're saying, it gives up so much of the game. It puts them at such a bad precedent for a lot of their policy objectives that you're like, okay, what is actually the ulterior motive here? What are they actually playing at? Because the only issue I would take with this take is that I don't really care if it's in the Constitution or not. Like even if there was a state public health emergency exception in the U.S. Constitution, to me, it violates base level human rights that, the state can create a potential emergency and then enforce it and force people to obey it outside of any property rights or property that they own. But outside of that, it's still a good take. But like you were saying, so much of like a lot of their other policy objectives hinges upon this this belief that, oh no, we can violate individual rights for the greater good of more people. Whether, like you're saying, climate change issues, or, David Hogg was, can't recall specifically any tweets about COVID that he had, but I remember him being fairly on the side of the regime in terms of lockdowns and how all those things were handled. And that's not to say he hasn't been on the side of the regime on basically every other type of gun safety, gun quote unquote safety law that they've issued that does not, have a blatant, like right in your face issue with the U.S. Constitution. So, and that's kind of the cornerstone of any sort of progressive and a lot of Republican as well politics is that, oh, well, for the greater good of society, we're going to violate individual people's rights. And it makes me think of, did you ever watch like the new Star Treks?
Yeah.
So like when Spock, like the whole thing of like the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and like that, that utilitarian like moral framework is just not. It's not actually a good framework to hold, because it leads to things like when the government can create emergencies or say that, like, oh no, we need to execute this innocent person in order to save thousands. It's like, no, like in that scenario I choose neither, because I will not be part of or contribute to evil. But these people don't necessarily care about that and other things, so it's just kind of a weird alternate reality I feel like maybe you and I have split into. But regardless, I'm still happy to see someone say this, because you can maybe hold them to it later, even though they won't acknowledge it.
I'm gonna really quickly actually you, and the Star Trek quote is actually from the original movies that they make reference to in the new ones.
All right.
So there you go.
I watched the original. Obviously, I didn't remember much of them.
Yeah, it's from Wrath of Khan, the original. So there you go.
The original Wrath of Khan.
Yeah. All right. Let me out myself there. But anyway, yeah, you're completely right. And the thing that's also shocking to me, I mean, it's not shocking to me, but it's shocking in the context of having such a clear and easy win on this, to see Michael Knowles of the Daily Wire, who I tend to think has, he is statist and authoritarian, but it's just like with all of the Daily Wire folks, it's this constant vacillation between you really nail this and you totally don't. And so, Knowles tweeted, I'm just trying to find the specific one here, but it was something to the effect of unpopular opinion, but I think that you do have the authority to basically suspend it. What was his?
Let me find. I actually had this as one we could have used.
Oh yeah.
And Joshua Smith replied to it, was pretty good. Let me find it.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah. Once you find it, let me know. But the main thing here is that this is why groups like the NRA, or just generally speaking, the Republican Party and conservatives are not helpful, because they ultimately are going to cave. In particular, conservatism is just the preservation of yesterday's ideals. It's not an actual principled stance. And so if you don't have a principled stance, and if your only allegiance is to a document that can change rather than the principles that undergird them, then you're going to end up with someone like Michael Knowles, who's trying to justify, even though he doesn't agree with the policy outcome, he's saying that, no, it's okay if they break the Constitution, because down the road, it's important from my worldview to be allowed to break the Constitution if it suits my needs. And that to me is maybe the biggest sort of, hey, Republicans, maybe you need to wake up a little bit. Don't just consider anyone who considers themselves conservative your ally if you actually value these principles. Maybe it's time to start looking for a group that's more affiliated with principles than with political power.
Yeah. For his previous tweet, Michael Knowles wrote, unpopular opinion, civil leaders do, in fact, have emergency authority to suspend temporarily many legal rights. And then what I really liked was Joshua Smith, Libertarian candidate for president, replied, now for the facts, you're wrong. And he highlighted sections of the Constitution that literally say neither the legislator nor any executive or judicial officer may disregard the provisions of the Constitution in case of emergency. And what I find really funny about Michael Knowles' take, is he, even if you grant that that leader, maybe let's just say it was in the Constitution for one reason or another, when the shoe was on the other foot and it was the COVID restrictions, and I'm not saying he does not want to ban guns or anything like that, but when the shoe was on the other foot and there were COVID restrictions and they were claiming it was emergency, the only point that he could argue against with that and stay from his philosophy, stay consistent, is that, it wasn't actually an emergency. It's like, well, the more powerful argument is that you don't need any of this for people to have the best outcome. As long as people are free to do and choose and reap the consequences of their actions as their choices dictate. But Michael Knowles has to constantly, because he doesn't have a principled stance that is focused on liberty, he's reduced to arguing that it wasn't a real emergency. And that's not a very good argument if you're trying to persuade people. It's better to persuade people and it's better outcomes in general to just let people be free to do what they choose. And as long as they can reap those consequences.
Yep. I just laugh at even the wording temporarily suspend. Oh yeah, the temporary suspension, like the temporary state of emergency for Washington state of COVID that lasted like nearly 3 years, you know?
Yeah.
Like cool.
It
Yeah,
would
I'm
bring
sure that
back two if they could, like right
yeah,
in an instant.
yeah, they want to, clearly.
Yeah.
The other thing is I think that Michael Knowles deleted that tweet. I
Oh, he
could
did.
not find it on
All right.
his timeline, and I think he retreated. So
Well, good for him, I guess. In that case,
I
full
suppose.
retraction would be better. But
Exactly.
All right, moving on to our next one. We've got a Twitter user named Ace replying to Zelda A. Gabriel, who's a Twitter user or maybe a real person name. I'm not really sure. But Zelda A. Gabriel is I believe, a little bit more conservative and was advocating for making abortion illegal. And in the cases of abortion being illegal, someone commented saying, well, if you're doing that, that means people are going to get arrested. And that's violence and not good. And then Zelda A. Gabriel replied, being arrested is not violence. And then Ace Archist wrote, if I grabbed you, threw you in the back of my car, and threw you in a cage, the state would consider what I did to be violent kidnapping. What do you think, Donnie? Is being arrested, is that something that could be considered violence?
I don't know of any serious individual who actually thinks that arresting isn't violence. The argument usually goes that it is a justified use of force, or it is a legitimate use of force or violence. This, to me, has shades of both the leftist argument that property damage isn't violence because it's, inconvenient to acknowledge that, and also the more this kind of just is statist. I've heard it from both people on the right and the left, where when they say something like, well, the state isn't forcing you to not have a choice. It's not forcing you to do anything. You have a choice. It's just, if you choose to not comply, then you get arrested. And that's just the consequence of your action. It's not a matter of either complying or violence. That's not true. You still have the choice. You're just choosing to be arrested, which is just a dumb, false choice. In the same way to say, oh yeah, you have a choice. If I'm holding a gun to your head and telling you to eat this bag of poop, you can choose to eat the bag of poop, or you can choose to get shot in the head. I'm not depriving you of a choice. Obviously, that's a ridiculous scenario, and I am depriving you of a choice because it's not a real choice. In the same way, saying being arrested is not violence. No, it is violence. You can say it's justified violence, but it is violence. You're not, just because you're putting it in the context in which it's not ideally maybe unmanaged or spontaneous or unprovoked, doesn't mean it's not violence. In the same way that I would argue, it's not like if I defend myself, if I'm attacked and I shoot someone in self-defense, I'm not saying, well, that wasn't killing someone.
Yeah,
no, I did kill someone. That was killing someone. It wasn't murder, but it was killing someone. And I have to acknowledge that. And in that case, that's why I'm not a total pacifist, right? Because I think that there are justifications where violence should be happening. And in the same way, you can make the argument that being arrested is a justified use of violence. I don't tend to think it is in most of these scenarios that they're presenting. But to say it's not violence is just trying to, I don't know, play this a dumb word game that ignores the basic problem by, rather than acknowledging and dealing with the ethical underpinning and justifying and reasoning out how you get to your position, just kind of denying that there's any kind of conflict. It's like saying, well, if you believe that there's a God, how do you justify that there's pain in the world? It's like, that's a real question that people have to answer on both sides. But I can't just say, well, there's no pain in the world. Like just ignoring the problem doesn't change the reality. In the same way, being arrested is violence. Just whether is it justified or not? That's where you have to go with this.
Exactly. And that's like what's kind of funny about this whole exchange is that I agree. I'm a pro-life absolutist. Like I believe in fully from conception. And I might also be on board with like, oh yeah, people that abort kids, especially the abortionists themselves, should be made unable to perform those types of actions. And a lot of people, like a lot of my more conservative friends and stuff, that are maybe more on the Michael Knowles side of things and want to have cops and still believe in the state and all these things, are like, well, isn't that contradictory to your libertarian anarchist viewpoint? It's like, no, like my anarchist viewpoint is undergirded by the non-aggression principle, which is aggression is only justified when it is either in defense of yourself or the innocent. And it means that I'm not supposed to use aggression in any other case unless it is, for defense. And that's what's unfortunate about this gal's argumentation is that she like jumped right to like saying like, well, being arrested is not violence, when really she should have just been saying like, yes, it is violence and it's justified violence because it's saving the life of an unborn baby. I mean, that's a way more compelling argument that doesn't get you in this like weird scenario where you have to justify like Ace Arcus, which is a good take, is saying that like, oh yeah, like anything that we did as a private citizen, if we did the same exact things that the police state do to people, and let's just say like we owned, like somehow we were able to acquire a section of highway and we were charging tolls, and then at our whim we could pull people over and detain them, arrest them, make them pay fines to us whether we wanted to or not, be like, oh yeah, you're highway pirates. Like that's what you would be. Or I mean, actually probably even be better to just say like a highway that we didn't even pay for, someone else paid for, other people paid for, and we commandeered it and said, hey, we're going to charge people for being on this. Like, so yeah, that would be awful and wrong, yet we accept that all the time from the police state. And it's the same thing with being arrested. You are at the mercy of whatever cop pulls you over, whatever cop decides they're going to do to you in that moment, because the second you resist, they have justification legally and from the broader community in general to basically do whatever they want to do to you, to hurt you. So these types of things are features, not bugs, of the police state. They are endemic to the system. I know many good cops. I went to church and sat next to one that I love very dearly on Sunday. But those cops succeed in spite of the system, not because of it. They are good people in a very bad system. It is not that it's just a system that can be reformed and there's tons of good people in it. The good apple is the exception. It is not the rule. And the way you could just tease it out is just like, think of like, am I able to do anything that cops are able to do and it be accepted by society? It's like, no. Well, if the answer is no, then it's not a moral action. It's actually something that is wrong. And if a cop is able to do it and it's accepted by society, if I was able to do something and it would be accepted by society, say I was saving a child's life, that's like, great, that's a good thing. And then anyone should have the ability and the power to do those types of things. But we grant cops a special exception to that rule.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the issue really is that the high-minded view, sort of the maybe the steelman argument for that, is that people who have good judgment and or expertise and essentially are wise, right? Like that's kind of the Platonic perfection of this. The Platonic ideal is wisdom in individuals being able to execute these things. The problem is that the state is a system that does not promote wise people to make wise choices. It incentivizes bad choices. It incentivizes corruption. So even if you were to say, yes, throwing someone in a cage after putting them in the back of your car, if done with wisdom to the right people and executed, with discretion, is the right thing, you can say, okay, so there is a scenario in which this hypothetically could be true, but now we have to recognize, is the state the best actor for that to happen? Yeah. And I think we can just see demonstrably that that's not true. Even if you're thinking about the sort of idyllic version of the state that a lot of conservatives kind of think, like the cops are the best and brightest of us, and like the whole government's bad, but for some reason this one institution is okay. I think that there's plenty of stories that have shown the rot from the inside of the police station, whether that's from overly conservative areas, using conservative broadly. I'm not necessarily political, but that tend to excuse police officers in what they do indiscriminately, and in the reverse, where police officers aren't able to do their jobs because of the system from the inside out. Like if you go to Seattle, where they can't stop violent crime. So whether it's through active actions that are done unjustly or inaction done unjustly, I think the state has proven itself to be a uniquely bad actor for promoting wise people to do things that should only be done in wisdom. So clearly, I don't think that, saying that being arrested isn't violence is an answer to any of that. I think it just tries to ride around, ignore the problem. And then I think Ace Arcus kind of highlights, no, this is violence, so let's contend with the real issue here.
Yeah. All right, moving on to our next one. We've got an ESPN tweet highlighting Aaron Rodgers. I believe he was out for some injury. I don't really watch football, so I don't know, but he's in a hospital bed, so I'm assuming he got hurt. And they write, Aaron Rodgers provides a post-surgery update. Surgery went great yesterday. Thank you for all the love and prayers and support. And thanks to this doctor and his staff for starting me on the road to recovery. And then a Twitter user, Tony X, retweets this saying, oh, now he trusts doctors, referencing specifically Aaron Rodgers' stand against the COVID vaccines and distrust of them. What do you think? Is Aaron Rodgers being a hypocrite here?
No, of course not. It's such an oversimplification. It's one of those things where if you take a principled stand on something and you're saying, look, just because there is this mass cultural sentiment on one way, it doesn't mean that I don't trust like that culture for other things, right? So let's assume just that every single doctor endorsed this, right? That there was no silence of dissenting opinions. Let's assume that was not the case. Let's also assume that there was no cultural pressure for people to endorse this vaccine. There was no monetary pressure to sell this vaccine. Let's remove all these external factors that are clearly biasing the direction of what a doctor is going to and want to recommend, okay? So let's just assume in good faith, every doctor has recommended this one vaccine. Me saying, hey, you know what? I'm not so sure that I trust this doctor on this one vaccine that's new and just now introduced. That in no way precludes me from saying, however, I do trust them when it comes to a litany of other issues that I have demonstrably seen done successfully, maybe had personal experience or had family and friend experience that was fine, seen overwhelming evidence and stature. It'd be one thing if, for instance, we had an institution that had like a 100% track record of clean behavior when it comes to medicines. Every single medicine that this industry produced was not corrupt. It worked flawlessly. There were no issues with the agreements that say, hey, by the way, if you get injured from this, you can't sue us. If that institution existed and then they said, yeah, this COVID vaccine's great, everyone would be fine with it. But the problem is that the very industry that it comes from is not that. It was an experimentally, quickly, drawn up vaccine. It was new. So a lot of people are going to be skeptical there. Then all of the other factors that I also pile on add to this. But the point is that you can be selective in what you do or don't trust doctors with if there is good and sufficient reason to do so. It's not like people just sort of randomly, indiscriminately picked this one thing to be distrustful on. It's kind of like, yeah, everyone picked this thing because it had something in common, which is it was rushed. There were a lot of things written about, you can't sue us if this is danger. Every single entity was pushing it on you. There's not a long track record of this being good. And the pharmaceutical industry is known to being corrupt and there be payments and all kinds of issues there. So it's just mind blowing that people can't separate like, hey, I don't have to buy every single thing this person says, but I can still trust them on their area of expertise and what I do know to see that is demonstrably true.
Yeah. I bet that Aaron Rodgers' amount of investigation into which doctor he went with for whatever surgery he was having for the issue that he's having, I bet he applied the same methodologies and thought processes to choosing that doctor or that surgeon as he did to the COVID vaccine. And that led him to the choice that he made of, both of the COVID vaccine of not getting it, as well as, I'm going to have surgery with whatever this doctor's name is. I don't know if he spelled it right or what, but it looks kind of weird. So I was thinking about, I chose not to get the COVID vaccine. And I mainly chose, one of the reasons I chose is because no one could give me a good reason to get the COVID vaccine that were medically, based. I had a lot of people tell me it'll be good because then you can go back to work or you can go visit these buildings for different types of calls and things like that. I was like, okay, well, that doesn't really matter to me. I'd rather not get some crazy drug that is new to the market and potentially lose my job than have potential issues for this thing. And when I would ask doctors about it, they would say the same thing. They would never give me any medically based advice other than they would say things like, oh, well, it's going to make it better for you. You can't get it or transmit it. But I was aware of the data. And I was like, no, I can get it and I can transmit it if I do get the vaccine. And this kind of correlates to a couple weeks ago, I had a knee injury at MMA. And I got an MRI of my knee, and the MRI technician thought I had a torn ACL. I guess the attending doctor for the MRI machine said, "Oh, I think your MRI shows a torn ACL," which is a pretty bad thing to have because it requires requires surgery and 12 months of rehab. I went into a surgeon, and I said, "Hey, like, can you tell me a bit more about this? Because like I'm looking at the actual MRI pictures, which they tell you not to do, but I did, and I'm comparing it to other MRI photos of healthy ACLs, and mine looks more like a healthy ACL." And the surgeon actually looked at it and he said, "Oh, you're right. Like these don't look like you have a torn ACL. Let me run some functional tests on your knee." And he did, and it turned out that I don't have a torn ACL. I just had another type of issue where some tissue got stuck in my knee joint. So if I had left it up to the doctors, if I just said, "Hey, their expert recommendation, they are the doctors, I'm just going to trust them," I would have a completely replaced ligament in my knee as opposed to just 2 weeks of rehab to fix whatever was going on, in there. And so it's like, yeah, I am going to do my own research because it's my own body. It's my own issues. It's this concept of extreme ownership, that all outcomes that relate to my body and relate to my life are owned by me, regardless of whether or not like I think I should be blamed for them or not. Like I own that. And because of that, I owe it to myself to actually be informed of why certain procedures are being done. And I might not have to understand all the minutia of them, but I need to at least understand the why and the benefit and the cost analysis of these procedures. And I'm sure that's what Aaron Rodgers did in both scenarios. And we both came to the same conclusion, in both ways, basically like saying like, oh yeah, like there is no benefit to me, a young, healthy male in his 20s, to get this experimental vaccine that doesn't protect the people around me and doesn't protect me. That makes no sense. I'm not going to do it. I'll just opt to get COVID because it's not going to hurt me. Aaron Rodgers made the same call as probably being one of the top 1%, physical specimens in the world. And when it came time for his surgery on whatever body part he needed surgery on, he made the same call. And it kind of reminded me of, do you remember when Rand Paul went to Canada for his surgery from that attack? And everyone's like, oh, Rand Paul, the capitalist, went to socialist medicine. And it's like, nah, he went to Canada to a private clinic that is a capitalist free market clinic. Like in the truest of the sense, it has none of the state involved in its funding because it was the best doctor for his issue. And him being a doctor evaluated all the doctors around and said, okay, I don't care whether they're in the US or they are in Canada or they're in France. Like, I'm going to go get the best type of treatment possible. And so, yeah, like I trust doctors in as much as that doctor becomes trustworthy to me. And to treat doctors as like uniform or they have all of the same opinions is just kind of silly. That's why they always ask, well, not they, but like it's kind of common wisdom to always get a second or third opinion. Because if you don't, like you're at the mercy of whatever kind of day or expertise that doctor you first saw had.
Yeah, Rand Paul going to that, and then everyone's saying, "Oh, he went to Canada." It's like, yeah, he went to the one privatized, hospital in Canada that was grandfathered in. Cool. Like, what a slam dunk. I'm glad you're actually arguing on the merits and looking into things. You can see why they don't want people doing their own research because they can barely do any research themselves, right? Like, they couldn't look up the one hospital he went to and find out anything about it, right? But I was going to say that the comparison here that I was trying to think of something like what's a similar situation where you have an expert who is inherently going to know more about something than you do just based on their expertise. And yet you still can trust them on 90% of things and doubt them in an individual case. And I don't know if this is a helpful example or not, but I was thinking like if you had a friend or a chef or someone who knew your food tastes very, very well, what you like and don't like. And let's say it's a chef friend of yours and he cooks all kinds of meals. And he says, I know almost perfectly what kinds of foods you do like. I know you like, you like spicy, but not too spicy. You like this texture, not that texture. And then he said, I really think you're going to like, this soup. But the soup in question, let's say it's a tomato soup, that you're like, I'm just really not a fan of tomatoes. And he's saying, no, trust me on this. Tomato soup doesn't really taste like tomatoes. It's different. It's got all these attributes that you do like. Do you not think that it is fair that knowing that you don't like tomatoes, like that about yourself, even though he is an expert, he's had tomato soup and you never have. He's made tomato soup. He knows all the other kinds of expertise of things of foods that you do and don't like. Do you still think that even if you ended up liking tomato soup, even if that was the end result, don't you think that it is still reasonable for you to say, I'm going to trust this guy on all the other food recommendations, but I'm going to be skeptical about his claim on tomato soup. Whether or not you end up liking it, I think that that's a perfectly reasonable and fair position to hold. And that's clearly what's the case is here. For Aaron Rodgers to be skeptical of the vaccine, to not want it, he doesn't have to necessarily distrust everything else about doctors and science and medicine or whatever. He can hold all of those things and still have a skepticism. Again, whether or not he's correct, that is a reasonable position to hold. And only in this weird hive mind collectivist COVID thought process has this even been demonized to a regular degree. It just feels like we're back in middle school, where you make fun of the one kid who doesn't like the thing that everyone else likes. Oh, you don't have an iPod? Like, cool. Like, I don't know. It's just,
so I don't know that feeling, but
I try to, I try to emulate the feeling in my head a little bit. If just thinking about being a Zune kid, maybe what it was like, but I don't know. It's just, to me, it's like, it's one of those things where
kid.
It's just one of those things where to me, I think that Aaron Rodgers is right. And I think that you're right in that you can demonstrably be skeptical and be correct in being skeptical. But even if he was completely wrong, it's not unreasonable, in my opinion, to have that kind of thought process and that thought pattern. There's no cognitive dissonance to distrust one element of an expert's research if there is good cause or reason to believe so. That there's nothing that contradicts there in my head.
Yeah, and there's kind of, like you were saying, just because the person is an expert in most of the topic that you are discussing doesn't mean that there are not other external or ancillary data points that can cause you to be skeptical of whether this person should be trustworthy or not. I was thinking about when we were moving from our first house, we had some white mold up in our attic, and I need to get some quotes for it to be fixed. And I got quotes ranging from $800 up to $14,000, for stuff to get fixed. And one of the guys that gave me a $14,000 quote, I said, "Hey man, like, this is really expensive. Like I told you, like I just want to get it all out of there. Like I don't need the fancy treatment or anything. Just get it all out and get it certified that there's no more mold." And he's like, "Okay, I'll do the most lean type of thing, just the expenses." So it's like, "Can you justify to me why your bid is so much higher than an $800 bid that had the same type of spec?" He said, "Oh, actually, I can actually drop it. I could drop it down to $7,000. I'm like, "Oh, dude, you got to at least provide me why you could drop it from what led you to dropping it from $14,000 to $7,000?" And he provided no update in scope, no reason for it, just saying like, "Oh yeah, I can do that." It's like, okay, now you've become untrustworthy to me, even though you know more about mold remediation, you know more about how to get it out of an attic, you know more about all the pricing. Like, there's something weird about the price going from double to half with me just raising a little bit of complaint. And what that signals to me is that you're not trustworthy. And that's the huge unfortunate part about the whole COVID stuff, is that, like, because of this one aspect that people were not, the experts were not able to back down on, that they kind of held their ground even though they were proven wrong time and time and time and time again, is now that I doubt everything that they say. Like I was just at the dentist this morning and they were trying to recommend some fluoride treatment and this and that. And I was just like, man, like, is this actually good? Like, I want to ask, what does this do for me? What is the actual data behind the success of this? Does this actually make my teeth, last longer? Like when they took the x-rays, like, oh, like I don't have any cavities. Great. But now I'm doubting this guy that I never had any cavities for like 26 years of my life. And then I did a promo for dentistry at like this place down in Renton. And the guy, the first time I went in, like said I had a cavity, and I looked at the x-rays. I was like, it doesn't look like I do, And he's like, no, you look like you're prone to cavities. And then the guy today, who I trust now, he seems like an honest guy. He's like, oh yeah, you're genetically, you not prone to get cavities. So it's like, man, like I'm doubting all of the medical advice I've ever gotten my whole life because of these people who have been dishonest, or they had ulterior motives that made no sense, or at least ulterior motives that weren't lined up with my own health interest. And I think the sooner doctors understand that the public like might now doubt things that are perfectly valid, but they doubt it because you kind of lied to them or you were dishonest with them for years, and you told them in the most important aspects of their life that they needed to be locked down, that they couldn't work, that they couldn't see their dying family members in the hospital, that a lot of them were shamed, and you contributed to people literally saying like, oh yeah, people that don't take the vaccines are like dogs that haven't gotten their vaccines. You contributed to people saying those types of things. So that's why they're going to be skeptical of any advice that you give. And it's on you to earn that trust back.
That's absolutely right.
All right. Moving on to our next one. We've got two tweets, or I'm not sure what Seth Dillon's is, but one is from Mike. Yeah. Okay, one is from Mike Cernovich. The other is from Seth Dillon, the editor-in-chief at the Babylon Bee. Seth Dillon writes, "You don't have to compromise to be effective. We often feel the need to find some kind of middle ground, usually because we want to be agreeable and avoid being offensive. That's squishy and weak and ultimately self-defeating. There's no middle ground on this issue. Life is either valuable or it isn't," specifically related to pro-life and abortion. "So I refuse to meet Rogan in the middle and grant an exception even for the hard case of rape. The moment you start making exceptions, you give up your footing. If life is ever sacred, and it's always sacred, there's an obvious, undeniable place where the line should be drawn. So we should draw it clearly and defend it unapologetically. Every time we compromise between right and wrong, wrong wins." And an unrelated tweet, but you would point out kind of related, is that Cernovich writes, "If you want to be pro-life, no exceptions, good for you. Lose every election, have no political power, then see what, quote, life looks like in a Bolshevik hellhole. Will you feel good because you didn't compromise as your children starve in another Holodomor? That's the alternative." What do you think between these two takes?
This is the classic lesser of two evils kind of reasoning, to the point where let's just keep shifting. It's weird coming from Cernovich, right? It's like he arbitrarily picks one issue, but Cernovich, why do you have to go that far? Because frankly, telling anyone that I mean, like upholding any kind of standard whatsoever is going to be unpolitical or unpopular politically at some point. So, okay, so you want to be pro-life, no exceptions, good for you, lose every election. Okay, well, you're right. Well, what if the population is just kind of mostly for this? Or, I don't know, what if we change the issue? What if it's not abortion? What if it's child sacrifice? What if the population is really on board with that? Or COVID lockdowns? What if the population really is on board for all that? It's a stupid argument, because at the point is that he doesn't understand that what we are currently experiencing when it comes to abortion is the hellhole. We are in that. We are the gravity of the situation is dire. It's not a matter of, things are going to get really bad. Things are really bad. Could they get worse? Sure, but that's an ever-moving goalpost. The point is that you don't compromise with evil. Like Seth Dillon's sake, I absolutely love that. Every time we compromise between right and wrong wins. I think that ultimately you have to have almost sort of a Lord of the Rings kind of perspective on these things, where it's like you can't wear the ring. You can't be the one who's going to take it away from the bad people and let it sort of exist in because you can wear it. Like, you need to let evil destroy itself, and you can only do that by not compromising with it, right? And I just think that maybe this is almost more of a spiritual than a political reality, but that's probably the issue when it comes to thinking about things in a political context rather than in a spiritual one. I just think that it's a very misguided thing to do.
I think a lot of political rhetoric, like it seeks to maximize like the outrage about all sorts of different types of things that are not necessarily there are things that could be compromised on. And I'm just putting on like my old, Brit as a Republican, like Ben Carson hat here for a minute, where let's argue about whether we should have a flat tax or some other tax. Like, from that perspective, it's like, okay, like there is a little bit of compromise that could happen potentially, right? Or should we spend money on a new library or a swimming pool, or something like that? Like, okay, there could be some compromise, there could be some discussion, but unfortunately, like, politicians in general seek to make every single issue that is there, like the issue they can run on, like the most moral thing one way or the other. And so, like, obviously we all know kind of inherently that, like, oh yeah, these aren't necessarily those type of do or die types of issues. And so it leads to this, like, well, what matters then is winning, so we can implement our ideal type of world. But when there is truly an evil issue that comes out, you've become so numb that you can't actually recognize that, oh yeah, this is the line in the sand. Like you're saying, child sacrifice, abortion should not be crossed like at any point in it. And it's like I would ask Cernovich, like, what is the line for you then? Is the line child sacrifice? Is it once the kid is out of the womb? And it's like you were saying, well, what if we get to that point and the Overton window and allowable discussion is now at that point? Are you saying like, oh, well, we need to win so that we can kind of change it back? It's like at a certain point, you just say, I'm opting out. I don't care if we win. Like, I'll go down with this ship because I believe that anything other than this is compromise. It is wrong. It is evil. And by me, compromising, I am making an evil choice. But that's like, that's the price we pay for having these types of people that are so desperate to win in power. They have made every decision and every type of issue that you can think of something that like you are either good or evil. And so, obviously we can't sustain that type of mind share of that. Just because someone wants a 10% flat tax doesn't mean that they're evil. I do believe that if someone wants to kill babies for the convenience of it, they are evil. And that is a line I'm willing to draw and not cross over into. And Cernovich doesn't make any, like you're saying, he just makes the lesser of two evils argument. But the problem with it is that's like the lesser of two evils today could just be like what is right tomorrow, depending on who you are. So you have to actually make a definitive statement that actually says something, that makes an argument for why you should stand for something or not stand for something. It is not actually just the will to power that matters. There actually are morals. And if Cernovich doesn't believe that, I think he does believe that there are morals, that are absolute morals. But if you don't believe that, then yeah, you are just like any of these cultural Marxists or any of these lefties that are willing to say or do or lie or cheat or steal to get what they want. But Cernovich is supposed to be the guy on the other side of that. So his take is bad. Seth Dillon's is good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I to sort of piggyback on what you're saying there with, when you're saying what is the lesser of two evils today seems just like what's right tomorrow, right? Like, oh, well, this isn't a compromise. This is the most extreme you could go. That's how the Overton window shifts to the place where it's been, where abortion is even palatable, is because we've gone down this road of compromising. And so now, like, the Overton window of what is quote unquote acceptable is exceptions for, rape or incest, which are difficult, tough things. But because people have compromised on that, that is now the furthest extreme that you can say without, to be quote unquote popular. But I don't think it has to be that way. I think that's the way that you die by 1,000 cuts. And that's the way that the cultural Marxists progress, incrementally moving forward and forward. I want to give sort of two examples of what I would say as counterexample. Well, one example of that being the case, and then one as a counterexample. The counterexample to start is and this is not nearly as contentious of an issue, and it's not nearly as big of a deal, and yet people are still afraid without a bold voice. And so that's what I think the key here is. So my colleague, Todd Myers, he's great. We don't agree on everything. He's a little too hawkish for my taste, but he's just excellent. He's the best. He's a great guy. He works on the environmental issues at Washington Policy Center, and he's on a lot of different councils. And I don't remember which specific council this is, so he'll have to correct me at some point. But he was on a council that gives block grant funding for different projects, okay, for different environmental, to help. I think it was the Salmon Recovery Council. That's what I believe it was. And it's they get funding, and then they can give different projects to help salmon recovery that they think will best, produce good salmon results for their recovery. They can give them grants and funding for those things. And I don't know where this ruling came from, but they were voting, essentially going to vote on this thing that would say, hey, we're now, like, the way that they decide how the grants are distributed is sort of through points. They award points to different projects, and then depending on how many points you get, you'll get those fundings distributed. There was going to be this ruling that was like, we are going to give projects that are funded by historically oppressed groups, we're just going to give them more points. Whether that's a minority, racially or sexually, and we're not going to consider the science of it. And so my colleague Todd Myers just said, "Hey, that's ridiculous. Like, it doesn't matter who the people are behind it. The point of this is to help salmon recover. Like, if we're not going to base it on science, then what are we even doing, providing grants for scientific projects if we're just basing it on things that aren't science?" And then one by one, other people, including the chair of the council, said, I agree with Todd. That makes sense. Yeah. People were afraid to speak up until Todd took the stand. And to me, it's like that's where you really easily could have said, well, we're not just giving only funding to those groups. We're just giving them a couple extra points. So, you know, we don't want to be an absolutist here. We can compromise. You know, we don't want to make enemies on this council. But no, it was being fearless and bold that pushed that back. But that said, no, we're not going to buy into this idea of identity politics creeping in at all. And you keep that. Otherwise, the Overton window keeps moving in and incrementally. And I think that this is where culturally the church has failed miserably when it comes to the topic of marriage. And to be clear, like there are a lot of, you know, people I know who I love who are in LGBTQ identities. I don't believe that is a moral way of living. I still love them and I want the best for them. I also don't believe that if they were to get with their partner, that would be marriage. But the problem is the church has done such a horrible position, or has taken such a horrible line to not culturally engage this issue, that for the past decade and a half or two, the church was told, be nice, treat them with love, and that's it. They were never told to stand up and to stop that kind of oppression and to give the philosophical reasoning why marriage is the way that it is and why marriage definition matters and all these things. And so what I would argue is that now we've come to the point where, because we didn't take that stand, again, the Overton window has completely shifted. And so now it's like, if you want to be elected, boy, you can't say that traditional marriage is what it is. And we're not necessarily at that point entirely yet, but clearly the cultural move has completely shifted because the church wasn't extreme in promoting what is right and true and good. And so to me, I think Cernovich, he not only is he saying, it's kind of the same argument that people used in Afghanistan, where it's like, well, we shouldn't have been here, but we can't leave now. It's the self-perpetuating defeatism of saying we can't stand up for the truth because we won't win. Therefore, we're going to make the truth harder to access every cycle from here on out, because we're going to keep shrinking and compromising more and never make a stand. And that, I think, is a losing strategy in the long run, as well as a wrong strategy for when it comes to engaging with truth.
Yeah. All right, moving on to our next one, and it is kind of a long one, but it's a good one. So Vivek Ramaswamy, Republican candidate for president, had a tweet or series of tweets laying out his education policy, which is awesome, which is get rid of the Department of Education. And he writes, my speech next Wednesday in D.C. will directly address this, exactly how we will shut down the U.S. Department of Education based on existing legal authority. I won't hold it against you for not knowing the first thing.
That one's actually a reply to
my bad. Yeah. Let's start. I'll start with Mark Cuban.
Yeah.
So Mark Cuban tweets at Vivek about his tweets and his stance on the Department of Education. He writes, so you want us to be a deadbeat country that doesn't pay its bills or fulfill its contractual obligations committed to by the three-letter agencies you would close, and instead spend that money on hiring 10,000 plus lawyers to handle the thousands of lawsuits that will end with billions in settlements? Maybe start a department of lawyers? I mean, that's Congress. As opposed to putting together a results-driven plan that defines where efficiencies and improvements can be implemented that result in our country being better educated and more energy efficient at lower cost to taxpayers. Unless, of course, you don't believe in any of this and you're just pandering like a politician. I'll play along. Or was Vivek stuff next? Is that?
Yeah, so then okay. Vivek says, I won't hold against you. Yep.
Sorry, folks. I was going
to say, Mark Cuban had quote retweeted Vivek's first thing, and then Vivek responds directly to Mark.
Okay, and he writes, I won't hold it against you for not knowing the first thing about the U.S. Department of Education. Here's how it will work. I'll take the $80 billion spent by the useless and toxic agency and put that dollars in the pockets of parents to send their kids to better schools. It's quite sensible, actually. And Mark Cuban replies, I'll play along. $80 billion will fund your UBI for school-age parents program. Let's do the math on a per-child basis. There are about 75 million kids 17 and under and 25 million 0 to 5 years old. Do the parents of those kids under 5 get anything? I'll presume not. So your $80 billion is allocated across 50 million kids. That's $1,600 per kid, right? Per year. $800 per semester. How do you think that $1,600 gets spent? But wait, there's more. Let's say parents are efficient buyers and schools go along with letting any child in. Do you think the best public schools will accept any child for $1,600? Possibly overflowing their schools, requiring more local and tax state money spent to expand? And I'm guessing your biggest donors will have something to say about who goes to their kids' schools. I don't know what that.
NIMBY-DAR, not in my backyard.
My not in my backyard DAR is strong on this one. So let's pretend that parents and schools figure out some equilibrium, and there are schools that will add the children for $1,600. Who is going to pay for those schools? Those schools bigger? Do you think $1,600 per additional child will cover the capital ongoing expenses bill? How happy do you think taxpayers with no kids will be about that? But wait, there is more. At first glance, giving $1,600 to parents may sound great, but the reality is not every parent can take their kids to school across town. So now you have kids who can only go to the closest school with only $1,600 per year to contribute, but those same schools may have really needed the funds that the DOE offered them. That money is gone, and they are now getting just $1,600 per student. Think that covers what they lost? If not, what happens to the kids that go to those schools? Do your economics advisors believe that the long-term cost to American taxpayers for kids that go to underperforming schools increase or decrease state and federal deficits? Just for clarification, I think there is unlimited room for improvement in how we handle education in this country. I just think your approach is really dumb. P.S. I did all this in about 30 minutes while watching the end of Ole Miss Tulane game. It's a great game. Speaking about some sports ball event. What do you think about all of that, Donnie?
I'm still not clear. I don't think he's this stupid, but the way that he's wording some of this makes me think like does he not understand that the federal government funds a vast, drastic minority of how much schools fund? Like, I think the federal government gives public schools about at most like 13% of their funding, maybe if that. It's like on average like 13% maybe. And so the first thing is to say, like, if a school is not able to operate with a 13% cut, assuming that no other child went there, because obviously per student coming in, the money goes there, then that school is poorly run and needs to reevaluate regardless of anything else here. Second, the whole issue is that when the money follows the students, then the schools have incentive to increase their capacity. They have incentive to increase their quality, to attract students, to be able to house that. And then when schools don't have those students, they need the money less, because having more students does cost something, and having fewer students means it costs less. And if you have a school that is costing a lot of money and having fewer students actually bankrupts it, then it needs to reform to either produce better outcomes so that students want to go there and parents want to send their kids there, or so that it is not being as wasteful so that the people who do remain are able to keep their school going in that way. So there's like a million things with this take that are so blatantly wrong and stupid for what Mark Cuban said. It's like he's making this assumption that without the Department of Education spending, all these schools are going to go under, and like as if like a market economy doesn't work in the way that it works, where he's like, well, how are kids supposed to get to the school across town? It's like, I don't know, maybe that creates incentive for more people to create a new private school that is up to the quality of the other school across town. Maybe there's a carpool system that forms from a bunch of kids who want to go to that school across town who can. There's infinite possibilities, and Mark Cuban's tweet is just dumb.
Yeah, his capping it off. I cringed so hard when he's like, I did this all in about 30 minutes while watching the end of this football game. I was like, yeah, and it shows.
Seriously.
Like you were saying, 13% or whatever of school budgets. I saw someone post the math below, I think in his state of Texas, that and other states that have implemented like not only like school choice programs where parents can choose to allocate certain amount of vouchers towards different types of programs and things like that. That would actually be more like $8,800 or $10,000 per year that parents would have the ability to choose to spend on their kids' education, which is more than the average cost of private school, in the state of Texas, right, which is where Mark Cuban is. So it's like, yeah, now suddenly parents can afford to put their kids in private schools. And like you were saying, the way the market responds to incentives and human action is that, oh yeah, if I just have to, like, let's say you had a public school, or not public school, you had a private school that now had the ability to get, maybe another 200 students. They had capacity in their building for another 200 students, and those 200 students represented $200,000 in extra revenue. But what was standing in their way was that they needed to make an investment of $500,000 into some sort of fleet of school buses to get the kids from this other side of town into their school building. It's like, oh yeah, they're going to drop that money like immediately. Like, people don't realize that like an investment that repays itself within a year and a half is like an investment that you should always take. Like, always take that investment. Every single venture capital firm, every single bank, anyone that has any sort of sense at all financially is going to fund that without any sort of hesitation. And so if you have a school that is amazing, that provides great education, that every single parent wants their kid to go to and is willing to go to, and there's only one little barrier of like transportation, they are going to figure out how to do that as long as the money is there. And that's the beauty of all of this, is you don't have to, like the parents that have the kids don't have to understand all of the economic wherewithals or barriers. They just need to know, oh, can I get my kid there? And the school's job is to figure out, oh yeah, you can. Please give me your money and I will educate your kid and get them here. The problem with the public school system, and this is what's so funny about Mark Cuban's description of it, like he's describing this dystopia where schools are overflowing and parents have to make the hard choice about where their kids are going to go, and they're not funded enough and educational standards are dropping. And it's like, you're just describing the status quo. Like, you're literally describing what is going on today. And then he acts like he's like, you know, these schools are going to lose money. It's like, well, it's not like the $80 billion is just being thrown in a pit somewhere. It's just being given back to parents to spend on education. So $80 billion has not been taken out of the education economy. It's just being given to people that can spend it in a way that most makes sense for them. And anyone that knows anything about the education system knows that the reason it's so expensive to educate students is because of our burgeoning administrative costs. It's like the biggest line item in all of these school budgets. I think it used to be that you had like one administrator for every, I think it was like 70 students or something like that before the Department of Education. And now it's like freaking flipped. I'm not joking. I think it's like 7 or 8 administrators. Not 7 or 8 administrators. I think you have like, I can't remember the ratio of it. I'll have to look it up and maybe we can post it on the episode. But it's huge. It's massive. Yeah. The ratio is gone off the charts. It's like the best way to address the school like cost problem is to get rid of the administration. And what bigger administration is there than a federal administration that doesn't have any insight or actual hands-on approach to any of these actual students in their day-to-day lives? It's like, that's the first one we should be getting rid of.
Absolutely. And the thing that made me laugh too is when you're talking about him describing the dystopia that is now, when he says, do your economic advisors believe that the long-term costs to American taxpayers for kids that go to underperforming schools increase or decrease state and federal deficits? I don't know, Mark Cuban. That's a good question though. How do you think that the students are doing in the public schools right now? How do you think that students are doing after the COVID lockdowns, when public schools forced students to not show up, forced them to do bad virtual options, and private schools opened way earlier, especially in places like Washington, where private schools were open basically a full year and a half before public schools reopened, and those, if you'd collected all those schools into a district, accounting for prior test scores, they did way better than people who were shut down. Like, the whole point is that in a free economy of choice, the people who deserve the money will get it in a much better way than in a system of government distribution. And so will it be perfect? No. Could there be potential for cost inflation? Maybe. But the reality is that, like you mentioned, the money isn't going anywhere. It's not like the money that he like tries to smear it by calling it a UBI program for parents. It's like, we're kind of in a UBI program, except that the money is automatically spent for you. That's the thing that I think he doesn't click in his brain. It's not like we're saying, hey, let's create a new program where we out of the blue give parents $2,000 of new money. No. This like $1,600 is already being spent in the education system. So if there is sort of cost inflation going on, it's happening, and it's happening exclusively at the public schools. And so private schools have to be lean because there is no money. So you could argue, with a program like this, there will be inflationary, like, oh, wow, suddenly private schools became $2,000 more expensive for no reason. You can argue that that might be the case, but the reality is that that is currently the case with every single public school, in the same way that the college loan system works, where it's like, oh, the government just said that every student basically has to be able to qualify for a loan. So now we're just going to grant all these loans, and schools say, hey, look, all these students are coming in with a lot of money. Now we can inflate our costs. And that's what's happening only within the public school system right now. So if you free that money, I say ideally you don't even tax people for it in the first place, and you let the free market do its thing. But if you're going to keep that system in place and keep the money locked into the education there, at least let the parents have the choice where it goes, so that there is a rewarding of the schools and the systems that are actually performing well for the students. Because right now it's causing inflationary costs, but it's not correlated with performance at all. Yeah. If the top performing schools started charging more, well, then another school would say, hey, look, we can catch up, we can beat them, because we've seen that a correlation of money to schools does not equal performance improvements. There's definitely some relation, like you need some money to operate, obviously, as a school, but just dumping money into school does not improve outcomes. So if schools are now incentivized, hey, if we improve our outcomes, we get more money, then you will see that happen. And that's the advantage of empowering parents in this kind of system, rather than just de facto granting it to these public schools, not based on merit, not based on outcomes at all.
Yeah, that's great points. And to kind of correct some of my earlier statements, I was in percentages, not in actual numbers. Okay. So I said, seven from the year 2000 to 2019, U.S. population grew about 9 to 10%, and then the student population basically grew with that. 7.6%. In that same time period, the number of school administrators grew 87.6%. Right, so literally 10x more. There are 10x more administrators to student ratio. In terms of growth over that period. And it's like, okay, when you look at this on a chart, and this is according to the Department of Education, right? So it's their own statistics, very much like their own statistics on the amount of school administrators that are child predators. It comes from within. So I think you can kind of trust that it's either that or worse in terms of how it all plays out. So, these, in the same way that like Social Security and any other government benefit is burdened under unneeded, wasteful administrative costs, the same thing is true of the education system. And it does, like you're saying, it doesn't yield better results. We had an amazing program here in Washington when I was being homeschooled, where if you signed up for a specific school district, they would actually give you a portion. It was kind of like these school choice things before it was like really a national deal and there wasn't a big old spotlight on it. But they would actually give my parents an X amount of dollars and help fund certain types of field trips and stuff. And it was awesome. It like paid for music lessons. It paid for me to get like co-op classes where, the teachers were actually professors at a community college that were also teaching part-time homeschool co-ops. So like those type of scenarios and those out of the box things that yield the best results for weird situations, like are enabled by parents being able to spend their money where it should be best spent. There's no way to incentivize, there's no way to incentivize labor and, teachers and resources for a marginalized group, let's say, then other than like there to be money available for that marginalized group to be able to be spent on it. People will hate on, and I know Mark Cuban's part of this type of system, but they'll hate on the pharmaceutical industry. Martin Shkreli, who had the life-saving, AIDS medication that, cost $2,000 a dose or whatever. But he made a really good point, and that's like, hey, like if only 1,000 people in the United States can buy this, and it cost me $5 million to develop, like I've got to recoup it some way, right? And so at least that that medication exists in that instance. And in the same way, like at least like certain types of educational situations could be addressed if parents had the money to spend on it. But right now they are forced into a system that has no regard or care for the various types of situations that their students might find themselves in.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, folks, thank you so much for hanging out with us on this one, and we will catch you on the next one.